Hey everybody, how you doing? Good. Well, let's just get on with the show. Today we're going to talk about the Porsche 911 GT3, which I've been so excited to drive and finally got the opportunity to do so last week, and it was great. Waiting for this car, it's kind of some insider baseball. This car was announced and a lot of people in the industry got to drive it like last year. And then Porsche had that whole issue with the engines and concern about them catching on fire and all that stuff, and they had to replace them all. And when they were replacing all the engines in all the GT3s, that meant there were no cars available to test. So that's why I haven't been able to drive one of these. But finally I did. And what was funny about waiting so long is that the entire time I was waiting, the anticipation just kept building and building and building and building, because everybody kept saying, oh, this thing is so awesome and it's so great. And you kind of get worried when your anticipation builds that much, because you fear that you're just going to build yourself up to get let down. But no, the GT3 did not let me down at all. It's an absolutely wonderful car. It's an interesting car too. It always has been in the Porsche hierarchy, because it's the turbo today is getting faster and more capable than the GT3 is, frankly. If you can't approach this model range like a linear hierarchy anymore. It's not just base model S, turbo GT3. It's kind of spreading out a bit more. You have to be a bit more nuanced in how you understand the models and how they compare. Like the turbo is basically, the Grand Touring, do anything car for everybody, every man, no matter what you want to do, you could do it in that car. The GT3 is focused in a bit more on driving, and that's what you really gotta love about it. It's slower than the turbo. Porsche, will say that you can basically at the factory option your Turbo S to have the GT3's tires. If you do that, I don't think anybody does, but you can, theoretically. And that car with those tires is, according to Porsche, faster around the Nürburgring than the GT3. It has more power. It's got more grip. It's, it's the faster car. Actually, not more grip, but it is faster. Excuse me. But it is a faster car. Now, Nürburgring times, being what they are, which is irrelevant, that demonstrates that this car doesn't really care about numbers. And that's a very important thing. We get, too often we're lost in what numbers are and what they mean, and having the quality of a car represented by its horsepower or torque or power to weight or lat G's or whatever. This car is about the driving experience. It's which is something you can't really quantify with a number, unless you say like the driving experience is a 10 out of 10, which is pretty close. You can't just measure that empirically and say, attach a number to it. And that's what makes it real hard to, that's what we strive to do when we do car reviews is, anybody, if you want to find the car that produces the highest numbers, anybody can look at a spec chart and do that. But that's why we use words to review cars, because it tries to get to the nuances, the stuff you can't really attach numbers to, and the qualities that don't get, or the qualities that get lost in numbers. And that's what the GT3 really comes down to. This is a car that's all about driving. It's all about driver satisfaction. It's all about putting the driver in control, giving them the tools to have all the fun they can. And that's kind of what it's about. You could say track focus, and yeah, it has that capability in it, but it's more about driving in general. If you like sporty driving, performance cars, sports cars in particular, this is what it's all about. And the reasons are, it's naturally aspirated, high revving engine, lots of lateral grip, lots of power, and just that there's driving character. But there's the intangibles that I always try to stress that are more important than the numbers. It has to do with outward visibility, seating position, steering feel, and tactility in that response. The way the car shifts, the way all these things aggregate into an experience when you drive the car. And it's true for all great sports cars, but all these things create this experience that leaves you feeling really satisfied. And that's something that this car does extraordinarily well. And that's something you kind of grow to expect from the GT3. Now, there will be a more hardcore version of this car in the future, from driving this, I can't tell you what that is. I have no idea what it could possibly be. This is, you know, I was saying this car doesn't really care about numbers, but it kind of puts down some awesome numbers too at the same time. So you're kind of getting the best of both worlds. You can still, you know, magazine race or bench race this car against other things, even though that's not really what the car intends to do. I kind of like to imagine that the numbers this thing produces come out as just sort of a accidental byproduct. But we could talk about numbers. Oh, that's convenient by looking at the dash. 9,000 RPM, probably being the most important number that comes out of this car. 9,000 RPM. It's fantastic. And you know, like, this thing makes peak power at like 8,250, and they just give you the extra 750 or 750, yeah, for fun. You know, like, you gotta imagine, like, I stress that I really enjoy high revving, naturally aspirated engines, even if they're slower than turbocharged engines, even if they don't make as much power. It's because the character of that power band of when you have a high revving engine is what makes it so much fun. You know, the way the power builds, it's in a very linear fashion, very predictable fashion. That's what you get out of naturally aspirated engines, is when you give it X% throttle, you get X% out of the engine, and you can expect that. With turbo cars that make tons of torque down low, you really have to recalibrate your driving style, and that's not bad. That's just the difference. And I really like this experience. I prefer it. I would rather have a high revving, naturally aspirated engine that makes less power than a turbocharged high torque engine if I'm in a car that I want to drive and enjoy the driving experience of. Not for daily driving, that's something else completely, or for, you know, drag racing or whatever. Even if the car's slower, I want that high revving, naturally aspirated characteristic, and that's what you get out of this GT3. It's a 3.8 liter flat six, and I have a cutaway, not a cutaway, but a technical detailed image of it. Not a great one, but a decent one. But 9,000 RPM, that's the thing you can't that's there just for driver's enjoyment, you know. We had this car the same time that we had a Camaro Z28, and we're doing a head-to-head on them. Of course we are. But the real telling thing about this car is that it makes peak torque after the Camaro's made peak horsepower. You know, so it's all at the top of the engine. But that's not to say that the bottom end of this engine is lifeless. I mean, this car pulls strongly, and the way the transmission's geared, you're never wanting power. The only thing you're wanting is to be at 9,000 RPM all the time, because I mentioned this a lot in the video. There's an ignition video on this. There's a head-to-head video on this. But I mentioned this a lot in the video, that the sound from about 5,000 to 8,500 is just, it's almost musical. It has this really beautiful sound to it that you can tell they've spent a lot of time tuning to sound a specific way. It sounds like you're at Le Mans listening to the 911 GT3 RS race cars, or RSRs fly by. And then the last 500 RPM, from 8,500 to 9,000, that howl kind of disappears, and in its place comes this metallic shriek that builds up for the last 5,000 or 500 RPM, and it's something you want to hear all the time. If, you know, I've said this about the 240, and, you know, it stands true with this car. If the measurement of a car's quality is how much of a jerk it makes you drive like, this is another great car, because it makes you do irresponsible things. But it's a fantastic, fantastic car. It's a very, you know, obviously special, different Porsche 911. I mean, it's still the same 911 shape, and, you know, you can give Porsche a lot of flack for that by just doing subtle variations on a theme. I don't mind. I like the shape. I like the design. I think some of this is a little bit too busier for me. I prefer the 50th anniversary 911. I just love the Fuchs wheels and the houndstooth seats. But a lot of this is all functional, or actually all of this is functional. The body's lower. I think it's like a 30 mil drop in ride height. You've got functional aerodynamic effects happening here. I mean, you just look at these sort of flaps right here around the wheels, and you can see there's a lot of functional stuff happening. Brake cooling, downforce in the wing, that wing's adjustable, flat underbody. There's all that stuff is happening here to make this car as good as it can with airflow. Like I mentioned, the wing's adjustable, and I can get into how we adjust it later. And also you got the center exhaust, which I believe is a GT3 specific thing. It's a much wider rear end. I believe it's the 911 Turbo's rear end. But what's interesting is that the rear track has increased significantly versus the standard 911S. I wrote it down. Where is it at? The standard 911S. The tread width, or the track, is the measurement from one side of the tire to the other side of the tire, front and rear axles, and it shows you, how much width you have between tires on the ground. And the 911 is 60.3 inches and 59.8 inches front and rear. That's the Carrera S. And then this is 61 inches front and 61.2 inches rear. So it actually has a wider rear track than the front, which is really interesting. But according to Porsche, this is it's inconsistent with their desire to give this car a sense of stability. And there's a lot of things in that concept, this concept of stability building into the car, and that's kind of what this whole car was, the 991 generation 911 was built around. That's why, you have a longer wheelbase that effectively moves the engine more towards the middle of the car than the rear. That's why you have big diameter tires, big diameter wheels. That's why you have four-wheel steering. It's why you have these sort of things coming together, making the car feel stable. And it works. It works really well. This is a car that gives you a lot of confidence the second you hop in it, and that's been something that's pretty common throughout the 991 range, 991 being this generation of 911. It's confusing, I know. But the thing that you notice when you hop in all these cars and turn a wheel is that you instantly feel in control of the car. You don't feel like the car's going to bite you. You don't feel like the car's going to snap at you. You feel you have a lot of confidence in the way the car behaves and the way the car drives, and that's not on accident. That's very purposeful, engineered into, a thing they engineered into the car. It's all there for a reason. I've got a lot of press photos on here because I like looking at this car a lot. I love this rear three-quarter. Sure, it's all touched up and photoshopped to hell and back, but this is very muscular, broad shape on the rear. I really like that look. That's a good shot right there. Again, processed like crazy, but then I got a lot of these. Maybe too many. Of course, you have center locking hubs on the wheels, which are pretty dumb, because they require an absurd amount of torque through a special Porsche tool to take the wheel off the car, which is, come on. I'm sure it reduces, unsprung mass by a few grams or whatever, but it's kind of annoying. Actually thinking about using this car on a track day and then, getting it up into the air on jack stands and then like, oh wait, can't get the wheels off now. Ooh, means you have to buy that special Porsche tool. I kind of wish you could get lug nuts, like normal human lug nuts on this car. But whatever, Porsche knows what they're doing. You gotta imagine. The interior, now we start talking about this stuff. We talked about four-wheel steering, and there's a lot of interesting things like that, a lot of adaptive technologies and hardware in this car that might make you think like, yeah, is this still a driver's car? The big one being the automatic, or the dual clutch transmission. This is PDK only. You also have an adaptive rear diff, an adjustable rear diff, an electronically adjustable rear diff that does some math and stuff based on what your driving inputs are. You also have brake actuated faux torque vectoring that we can talk a little bit about later. You have the four-wheel steering, and there's a lot of these electronic variable controls in this car, which you typically don't see on driver-focused cars, because these sort of electronic variable devices can introduce some uncertainty in how the car is going to respond. If you go through the same corner 10 times the same way, the car has the potential to do something different every single time. It's safe to say with this car that's not the case. This car responds very linearly. You don't realize a lot of that stuff's happening unless you have very finely tuned butt on the steering wheel or on the seat. The car is very, very good at hiding all of these variable features and making the car feel like it doesn't have them, when in effect you're getting the bonuses and the effects out of them, at least to my butt. I couldn't sense much of it. You know intellectually the stuff's happening, but when you're just focusing on the driving experience, you can't really feel it, which is really nice. But the PDK, yeah, it's a 7-speed dual clutch gearbox, and it's automatic only, and that made a lot of people pull their hair out in terror. But you know what? It works. Once you experience this PDK, I couldn't think of this car with a manual. I'd like to try it just to see what it's like. But this sort of the sharpness out of the PDK matches the sharpness and response out of the engine and the rest of the car. I always try to get back to what suits the car. There's a certain characteristic that's, again, an aggregate of all the decisions that built into the car, and you want the transmission that best matches that aggregate, that best matches that experience, and this PDK does. That may sound like a lot of nonsense, and it kind of is, but it's, basically how the driveline works, how quickly this engine revs, how much it likes that sort of quickness and that quick response, the fast shifts out of the PDK, and they are fast. That's how you get that. They've reduced the travel that the paddles need behind the steering wheel to get a shift. So you just glance it with your fingers and you're in the next gear when you're shifting it manually. But you don't have to shift it manually. You can put it in sport mode, and the PDK's logic is such that you don't need to shift. If you're entering a corner hard, it'll downshift for you and put you in the low gear, or put you in the right gear right before red line, so you can ride that corner or ride that gear out of the corner. It doesn't, it upshifts automatically. It does all that stuff for you, so you can concentrate on placing the car and using the throttle to drive the car around. And it's really good because the speeds this car is capable of, you don't want to be screwing around grabbing paddles and all that stuff. You can grab paddles, that's totally fine. I just found that when I did it, driving in manual mode, I'd grab the paddle and it would shift so fast that I would be in the next gear before I even realized it. Like, there was sort of, you drive a lot of these cars and you expect a certain delay. I mean, we're talking milliseconds. It's not a big delay of time. And you grab the gear in this car and your mind doesn't react fast enough. You kind of go, oh yeah, oh, okay, oh, we're already there, oh, okay. So that sort of, until you get used to it, that sort of pause can actually shake your concentration and ultimately slow you down. So I drove on the road in manual because I I want to kind of be through a chicane that I know really well on a road. I want to be able to choose the gear to sort of ride it through there. But for track use, and we did a lot of track use with this car, leave it in automatic, let the shift logic deal with it, and it worked excellently. And it's interesting, and sort of a nod to all the hubbub about not having a clutch pedal. If you grab both shifters in, you're effectively push the clutch in, like it's a declutch mechanism, like hitting the clutch in, and you just grab that. I couldn't really find a use for it, but it's I guess it's a token that Porsche understands that people are nervous about not having clutch control, but it actually also kind of demonstrates what good is that. What good is just going into neutral, clutch kicking, I guess, but you don't really need to do that if you can flick it in if you want to do a drift. So anyway, here is the car itself, and the cutaway is really cool. I love looking at this stuff. Where should we even start? So, it's interesting. They still run on McPherson struts on the front, multi-link in the rear. You have, here here's your anti-roll bars. They're adjustable. They have, I believe, 3 adjustable points. In fact, the entire suspension on this car is just adjustable past, camber, toe, and all that stuff, your basic alignment settings. You can also dial in ride height and anti-roll bars, and the owner's manual actually tells you how, which is really cool. That's stuff you don't really see in a lot of production cars, especially, adjustable anti-roll bars. But it's really cool that, Porsche will sell you this car and allow you to tailor the handling to your specifications, which is really interesting. we tested this car twice actually. The first time they gave it to us, it was like set up for drifting. Like you'd turn in and the back end would unload and you'd just power slide and smoke would be pouring off the back. And so they picked the car back up and I said like, hey, it's like on the drift scale, it's like a 10. It needs to be like a 7 or 6. And then they gave it back to us and it was still really, really loose, as you can see in the video I uploaded. That was, by the way, the video I uploaded on this channel of the laps, that was that was after the suspension fix or the suspension change to make it a little bit less oversteery. So you can imagine how oversteery it was before that. I mean, it was absolutely nuts before that. But the nice thing is about having that adjustability is that means you can tailor the car to drive whatever you want. You can tailor behavior into it. If you want it to be really loose, you can do that. If you want it to be really pushy, you can do that. It's all in the bars. It's all in the alignment settings that you specify, which is really cool. 2-seat only, which it's great because 911 rear seats are useless anyway. And then driveline and all that madness is back here. There's a lot to talk about with the rear axle because there's a lot of stuff happening back there. It's kind of the singing, dancing, do everything sort of piece on the car. But the engine, the 3.8 liter flat six. Flat six, here's cylinder. It's not like what you expect to see a normal engine. It's a very different engine, but it's a very high revving engine. They accomplish that by having like an absurdly big bore and a very short stroke. Bore is the diameter of the piston, and the stroke is the length the piston has to travel, right? So if you have, if the piston doesn't have to travel a lot, and the bore is really big, that means you get a lot of you can do very high piston speeds, and that means you have a lot of high RPM capability. If you have the small diameter piston, a narrow bore or a tight bore, and a long stroke, you can build power lower in the RPM range, but you won't be able to have high RPM power because piston's moving too much, and there's issues that happen with that. That's kind of a crash course in bore and stroke. But essentially, when you have an engine that's big bore, short stroke, it's high revving, high power, and high revving, and high power in the high part of its RPM band, excuse me. And if you have a small bore, big stroke engine that's a low RPM, low power, or high power in the low RPM part of the range. And this is a big bore short stroke engine, 102.6 mil bore, 77.5 mil stroke. I mean, that's a big bore. that's when I saw that I was like, what, really? That's how you get 9,000 RPM out of a flat six. Of course, you do all the other stuff: variable valve timing, variable cam positioning, direct injection. All that stuff is here. And this thing actually has a really high compression ratio, 12.9 to 1, and that's enabled partly by direct injection. But really, really cool. What else is going on in this engine? There's unfortunately a lot of technical detail on the engine, but it's a beautiful, beautiful engine. A lot of people were kind of lamenting the death of the Metzger engine in the previous GT3s. That was an amazing engine, but I don't miss it, out of this, because this thing is really, really, really wonderful. It's attached to the chassis with dynamic engine mounts. And dynamic engine mounts, I believe it's a magnetically responsive fluid in those mounts. And what that enables the mounts to do is to go soft to hard really quickly. And so that means, and it does so based on your driving style. So when you're driving around town tooling, they can make those mounts really soft, and that means the engine can vibrate around and not really, make the chassis feel too rigid or too stiff. But when you start driving it hard, they can stiffen the mounts and make it like a rigid, solid engine mount, and you can get the response out of the engine that you expect when you're pushing it hard. So that gives this car really nice, it gives this car really nice personality around town, because yeah, it's a low car, so you have to watch out on curbs and stuff, but the ride quality is smooth. You don't feel movement in the back from the engine, from driveline shaking around, and that's kind of what we report as secondary or tertiary movements in the suspension. That's typically just driveline shifting around, and so those engine mounts really they must make that change. I say they must make because I haven't driven this car around with normal engine mounts, so I can't really compare the two, but I'd be interested if there is a GT3 prototype with solid engine mounts or normal engine mounts or normal rubber engine mounts. somewhere that it would be really interesting to see the difference. I think that's why the shifts can be as fast as they are, but still be as smooth as they are. That's the thing that it's talking about shift speed, but also shift smoothness is a very interesting thing. If you didn't hear the engine, if you weren't looking at the tach, you'd barely notice that you'd shifted. It's a really bizarrely smooth shift, and I like that. I prefer that shift than, you know, the smack your head forward upshift that you get out of a lot of other sports cars. I think, you know, I don't like the upshifts to move me or the body while I'm driving, and I want that to be a smooth experience. And it's here, and I think that may have to do with the engine mounts just going from hard to soft to hard in this very short window of that upshift. And that's kind of the time frame we could be looking at. I say this because this is all theorizing, but yeah, the engine is the engine's very, very cool. It's a lot to cram in there, but I'm kind of just rambling through it, but forgive me. Oh, here are the mounts themselves. Yeah, so there's a magnetically response, or a fluid in there, an oil in there that responds to magnetic charge, and that can stiffen or soften basically the characteristic of the mount. So you got a tuner car, you put solid engine mounts, and all of a sudden the thing's undrivable on the street because everything's vibrating. Well, you don't get that downside here. The con against this is that it's really expensive, and that's why this car costs $130,000. But in the driving experience, you realize where all that money goes real quickly. It makes a lot of sense. This is the rear axle. Oh God, am I brain farting here? I'm totally brain farting here. Yeah, it's front axle. This is the front axle. Ugh. Stupid me. So front axle is pretty normal. I mean, there's new hardware in here because it's the GT3. So basically, it's all, you know, new structures, new hardware, stronger, more durable components built for the higher, you know, cornering forces and loads that the car is going to place on it, and also the better response out of it. The brakes are substantial. The standard ones are, I don't know if they're steel or if they're a hybrid, but our test car had carbon ceramics on them, which are just ridiculous. It's a 16.1 inch diameter rotor on the front with 6-piston calipers. It's just ludicrous. But you know, the brakes work well. Steering is still electrically assisted. That's this guy right here. That's the motor right there. And people have seen a lot of complaints about that. And I don't get it. Unless a really good electronically assisted steering in a sports car is better than a hydraulic system. At least that's been my experience. It does eliminate a lot of the noise that you get through the steering wheel. And we're talking like real subtle stuff. This isn't like you jump and you notice it. You need a lot of experience holding that wheel to understand. But the electric system damps out a lot of the noise that you get through the wheel, and what it gives in return is a lot of accuracy. And I'd take accuracy, you know, any day of the week over that noise and sensation. You still know what the front tires are doing. You can still sense when understeer is coming on. You still know where to place them. But the precision with which you can turn the wheel and dial in the front end is terrific. And that's something that electronic, the sophistication that comes with electronic controls really comes together. You know, with the hydraulic systems, you can cavitate the pump and sort of lose feel that way. Sometimes, this isn't 911s, this is kind of other hydraulic systems, but you can kind of feel like the pumps or the hydraulic fluid is following your inputs. I've noticed that a few times, especially around the figure 8. But the electronic system, you don't get that. Now, I'm not saying all electronic systems are better. What I'm saying is that the one in 911 is really good, and I don't get some of the critique it has because the car feels very much alive. It does not feel deadened or numb. It feels precise and terrific. So yeah, it's something I've never really understood. I like this steering system a lot. Now on the rear axle, there's a lot of stuff happening here, as I mentioned. So like the front axle, the rear axle steers the car. You have a 4-wheel steering system on it. It is, I believe it's this guy right here. I believe this is the motor for it, although I could be completely wrong and making an ass out of myself. I do that from time to time. It's been a long weekend. But anyway, so what the rear steering system does is it can turn the rear wheels 1.5 degrees in or out of phase with the front wheels. And so what that accomplishes is below 30 miles an hour, the rear wheels will turn out of phase with the front. So if the front wheels turn left, the rear wheels turn right. And what that does is it gives you a smaller turning rate diameter. You know, the car will turn tighter with the wheels doing that. Porsche says it virtually shortens the wheelbase by, like, they say like 4 to 6 inches or something like that. I forget, maybe it's 4.6 inches, which is a funny way of saying it, but it basically tightens the turning radius at low speeds. And then at speeds, I think it's above 50 miles an hour, the wheels turn in phase with the fronts. And what that does is that it does the inverse. It makes the turning radius larger, but that also makes the car feel more stable at speed. So it's another one of those things that gives you the best of both worlds. And that's good drivability around town, really tight turning radiuses. I mean, really, this thing can not turn on a dime, but like almost within 2 lanes it can turn around, do a 180, which is really cool. But at high speed, you still have a great sense of stability. Now on the rear, we have an active locking differential, which would be right here, if it was there. And the active diff, basically goes from full open to full lock, depending on what it determines you need out of the car, and it works very, very well. I tend to like normal, like non-variable locking diffs, ones that just lock at a certain point. But a good electronic system, a good electronically controlled system like this one, makes you appreciate when it's done right. And then we also have Porsche torque vectoring, which is not actually torque vectoring, because you're not overdriving the wheel. It's what it's doing is it does selective brake application. So if you come into a corner too hot, the ABS system will intelligently dither brake application, wheel specific brake application, to help the car turn better. And that works really well in practice. On the road, it feels great. You feel like when you're driving this car on the road hard, you get the faint edges of the stability controls intervention. You can just sort of suss it out, but it doesn't feel like it's slowing you down. It doesn't feel like it's hurting you. It just feels like it's like, here's just the faintest safety net you could think of, and it feels great on a road with everything on. Turn it off though, and this car becomes an absolute madman, especially in the way we had it. Absolutely, in the way we had it. It's terrific, and that's nice because you have that flexibility in the car. What was the other thing on the rear axle? It also has a lot of power. What was before we talk about that? What am I missing? I feel like I'm missing a ton of stuff because there is a lot of cool stuff on this car. The PDK gearing is specific to this car. It's shorter overall than pretty much all the rest of the 911s, and that means you have some mechanical horsepower at your bidding. Makes for very quick acceleration. The acceleration results in this car, we did the quarter in 11.3 seconds at 122.9 miles an hour. So when I was saying, like, this isn't a numbers car, but it's also a numbers car. Like 11.3 out of a naturally aspirated Porsche. It's terrific. Launch control is great too. You turn the car on, you get everything nice and warm. You mash the brake, you mash the gas, you release the brake, and that's it. Like, there's no extra steps to the process. It's so simple, you wonder why anybody does it differently. Like everybody else who has a launch control system, they overcomplicate it. Porsche, you just hop in, brake, gas, go. That's it. And I love that. Braking was 98 feet, 60 to 0. But what's important is that all the stops in the brake tests were done, were under 100 feet, basically. So it's not just the peak performance, but also the consistent performance. So those carbon ceramic rotors, and our car was on Michelin Pilot Sport Cup 2s. Those things work really, really well. And then the figure 8 was a 22.8 second lap ultimately. And that was even in like loose mode. I think there's more time in the car if it was a little bit less loose, a little bit more neutral. But a 22.8 second lap is To put it in perspective, the Z06 with the Z07 package was 22.5, and that's 650 horse. And 1.15 lat G. This thing did 1.11 average lat G. So this is a hell of a car in terms of numbers, but it's also like a friendlier car than the Z06 was. Because it doesn't feel so extreme. Like, it's not like straining your arm because you're holding on. It's actually really a comfortable car to drive quickly. A lot of fun, but comfortable. Some work too. So our yellow car, we had a very yellow car. This thing looks good in white. I'd recommend it in white. Yellow is very look at me. It has the projector lights, which is pretty cool because this reminds me a lot of the 918. Because the outside, you'll see some of the I don't know if it's the daylight setting, or I forget which setting it is, but it gives you the 4 lights, which is really cool. That was my favorite thing about the 918 was the way that was done. Here are the front wheels. Again, center locking hub, carbon ceramics, massive rotors, massive calipers, lots of tire too, which is nice. What was the front tire here? It's a 245 35 20, and then on the rears, it's a 305. Where is it at? 305 30/20. So a lot of rear tire, because that's where all your weight bias is. Speaking of weight, this thing weighs less than 3,300 pounds, and you've got just under 500 horsepower, 475 horse or so, with under 3,200 pounds. That's a good mix. Here's some of the aerodynamic things. These you see these more and more on performance cars. This little slat here to help guide airflow around the wheel. Just a neat little thing. A lot of super serious performance cars have that now. The wing, our friends at the CHP, they're there just to we hire them for shoots to where we have to permit it. We have to hire a CHP for shoots just to be there and make sure we're not doing anything dumb. And so that's why they're there. But there's the wing. That was kind of the reason why I took this picture. It's a terrible picture. I don't even know why I included it in here. Center mounted exhaust. This also has a flap actuated by a button on the dash, and according to Porsche, it actually increases power a bit in the mid-range when you have it open. It also sounds really cool when you have the sport button pressed, so you basically drive with the sport button pressed all the time. I don't even know why you would want to shut it, because it sounds terrific. You can see the width in the rear from this shot, and you can see how much that rear wheel comes out versus a standard 911. It's a lot. It's a lot. The inlets that go to the engine, this is going to feed the intake and some vents. Which vents? I'm spacing on the vents that it's feeding. And here's the dash from the driver's seat. This is what it looks like inside, and this is a beautiful thing. I, again, love that 9,000 RPM. And I love how they separate stability control and traction control off buttons. It's really interesting how they do that. It's not just like a press and then press to hold. It's like, no, you have stability control off and then stability control plus traction control off. Interesting how they do that. And that's it. Like a really simple, sport mode, off, loud, go. This is a very driver-focused car, which is really neat. And then here's the shifter itself. The shift pattern is the way I prefer it, which is back for upshifts, forward for downshifts if you want to use the shifter. I never did. I stuck to the paddles, because when you have paddles, why would you ever use the shifter? So that's pretty neat, and it's interesting how they did a little red detail on the plus or minus. That's kind of interesting. Let me go back a few, sorry. So this guy on the right here, this is the multi-page info screen. It has a couple neat toys. One of which is an accelerometer, which is really cool because it'll show you, how many G's you're pulling during, like, longitudinally and laterally, which is pretty neat. You try to basically, if you could draw a circle, you're going real fast. If you can draw a circle out here, you're going real fast because that means you're accelerating hard, you're braking hard, you're turning hard, and so on. That's real fun. And what's really cool is there's a performance meter, and this is your horsepower curve. So when you're driving along, you can see exactly how much horsepower you're making. Actually, not exactly because there's no axis here, but you can see, these are revs at the bottom, and this is your horsepower curve. And that's really neat. You can see basically the high RPM stuff, like what I was mentioning about 4,000 to 5,000 to 9,000 RPM. That's where the meat of the power band is. This doesn't feel bad, but this is where the fun stuff is. And you can see there's a pretty, considerable changeover in the character of the engine from beneath 4 and above 4, which is cool. There's also one for torque. Oh, yeah, so I took a picture of it too. Same thing. You can see that how the torque changes. It's like it's getting on a different, shorter intake manifold, and that's when the cam comes in. It's like all these little things happen at 4,000 RPM, and the engine comes to life right here. Comes to life implies that it's dead. Below that, it's not. I keep saying that, but the top end on this car is just amazing. Amazing. So much fun. And then no rear seats. You just get some... also, this is what you see when you pop the rear hatch. You can't see the engine. You can see the engine by sticking your head underneath it. You just have these fans for coolant stuff, and then this carbon fiber piece across the top, where you add oil, where you add coolant, or where you add windshield washer fluid, all that fun stuff. And there's the inlet. This is the frunk. I took this picture because it's a rear engine car, so there's no trunk, but there's some actually decent cargo space in the front here. You could fit a bag, you could fit a pretty good sized piece of luggage and some other stuff in there. Road trip would not be out of reason in this car, which is really cool. This is what I was really excited to find. When you open the owner's manual, you find this pamphlet that tells you what to do to your GT3 before you drive it on the race circuit. A lot of this is legalese. A lot of this is just making sure you can't sue Porsche, but it's also really neat to see this kind of stuff. I mean, it's like, here's your guide for track days from the manufacturer. The opening, GT3 is a high-performance car approved for road use, but one that can handle the whole spectrum of driving, from everyday road use to sessions on a race circuit. Basically what it's telling you is stuff you already know. Racetracks increase the wear on your car, and this is how you deal with that. This is how you anticipate that. And what's really cool is that there's this whole pamphlet in the car about that, and that means Porsche expects you to do this. And that's really neat. Like, it's great that Porsche builds a car and says, like, hey, we know you're going to do track days. Here's what you should be aware of when you do that. Here's how you check. Here's how you check your pads. Here's how you check your rotors. Interestingly, with the carbon ceramics, you actually need a special tool to measure the pads, because they don't wear like normal pads do. I'm sorry, not pads, the rotors. The rotors wear differently than... Carbon ceramic rotors wear differently than steel or hybridized rotors do. I was actually told at one point, I forget from who, but that the best way to measure the life of a carbon ceramic rotor was to weigh it. It loses mass throughout its life, and once it gets underneath a certain mass window, that's when you replace it. It's an interesting thing to learn. Talking about checking your brake fluid, your hoses, your lines. This is basic stuff, but it's really cool to see, like, hey, you may want to make sure your brake vents are okay. Interesting thing about, it tells you how to monitor your tire pressures and say, hey, if tire pressures get to this point, that's not good. You should fill it with this. Keep an eye on this. It also says don't use slicks, but I think this is legalese more than anything else, because it says slicks are going to increase the wear on your hubs and your axles and so on, and just be aware for that. But I'm pretty sure they expect people to do that. How to set up your chassis, how to adjust camber, toe in, ride height, any roll bars, all right here, which is really cool. This is really, really neat. They just tell you how to do this. Yeah, that's great. I love that. How to adjust your wing, where to apply the torque, and how to change the attack. If you feel like you need more downforce on the rear, you can make that happen, which is really, really cool. Where your engine oil should be at. 3 segments above the minimum mark. Not full, but 3 segments above the minimum mark for a racetrack. And then it tells you the delta between min and max, which is not a lot. I think it's a quart between min and max. So you add oil in half quart segments, which is pretty neat. And then it also says it gives you a recommendation on oil changes for racetrack use, which is really cool. And then here's your maintenance. So I read this and I was kind of shocked. 6,000 miles, replace all bolts and hubs and wheel bearings on axle. That's insane. And then I found out why they have this parenthetical. 6,000 racetrack miles is comparable to 2.5 24-hour Nürburgring races. And I love that it's in an owner's manual because it explains, it's accurate in explaining how long that is. Like if you were to go drive the Nürburgring at race pace for 48 hours plus 12 hours. I can't do the math right now. It's late. But that's a long time to be driving a race pace. And it's really cool that they actually explain what that is. It's major work that it requires at that point. But it's neat that they explain. That's what they recommend. It's really cool. And then here's more adjustments. I just love that they put this stuff in the car because they expect you to do this. 6,000 miles of racetrack, changed the oil after 2.5 times 24 endurance races on the Nürburgring. And then at Big Willow, this is a couple days later, no, the next day, we were at Big Willow and I was getting ready to go out and I looked down and saw the nav and I saw the actual turn indicators were on the nav, which was awesome. Front straight, turn 1, turn 3, back straight. It was really cool to see. I mean, that's little touches like that really tell you that this car is about motorsports and the people that made this are about motorsports. Those little touches really tell you someone cared, which is really neat. And that's kind of going to do it. I mean, this felt kind of light. I feel like I rambled a bit, but I think I got through the really cool stuff about this car. And there is a lot of really amazing stuff. And it's, again, stuff that doesn't come by just looking at the specs. It's stuff that you only really suss out when you drive the car and when you experience it. It's one of those, it's those intangible things that that make the car worth driving. And it's not just numbers. You know, these cars are more than Excel spreadsheets. They're things that function in really neat, interesting ways, and this car really exemplifies that. It also puts down amazing numbers too at the same time. So, you know, it kind of just, again, gives you all the worlds. So I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, and I'll see you next time.